Chapter 1. The Dream of Fatou. In the bustling town of Bamako, nestled by the river Niger, Fatou's heart beat in rhythm with the melodies of Mali's traditional music. She had always felt an intense pull toward the Kora, the stringed instrument that spoke the language of her people. From a young age, Fatou was captivated by its intricate sounds, the delicate pluck of the strings, and the stories woven through each note. But in a society where the role of a woman was confined to the household and the traditional roles assigned to her, dreaming of becoming a Kora player felt almost like a forbidden ambition. Women were expected to take care of the home, to maintain their place in the background, not to challenge the boundaries of a male-dominated tradition. Despite the constraints, Fatou could not ignore the voice within her. Every day, she watched the male griots, the traditional storytellers and musicians, play their instruments, weaving songs of history and culture. The men in her community were praised for their musical abilities, their skill with the Kora, and their ability to pass down the rich stories of the past. But what about her? Could she, a young woman, break through the invisible barriers that held her back? Fatou dreamed of mastering the Kora, not for fame or fortune, but for the deep connection she felt with the instrument. She envisioned herself playing in front of an audience, her fingers dancing on the strings, telling stories of her own. But the path she dreamed of seemed so far from her reach. How could she convince her family and the elders of her community to accept a woman taking on such a role? The thought of disobeying societal norms filled her with both excitement and fear. Yet, the more Fatou thought about it, the stronger her resolve became. She could no longer suppress the music that called to her from deep within. Chapter 2. A Meeting with Amadou. Fatou's resolve to pursue her dreams led her to the edge of Bamako, where the sound of music was more than just a background hum, it was the essence of the village. She wandered through the streets, watching griots perform on street corners and in open-air markets. It was here, in the heart of Mali's musical culture, that she first met Amadou, a seasoned griot who was known for his skill with the Kora. His music filled the air with the haunting beauty of Mali's ancient stories. His fingers moved with grace across the strings, pulling a sweet melody that seemed to captivate everyone around him. Fatou, with her heart racing, approached him. She had heard of Amadou's reputation and knew that he was one of the few who could truly teach her the art of playing the Kora. But the thought of asking for his mentorship felt like stepping into the unknown. Would he even consider teaching a young woman like her? Amadou looked up from his instrument, his eyes soft yet knowing. He had seen many young people come and go, chasing their dreams, but Fatou's gaze was different. It was filled with a deep yearning, a quiet determination that spoke louder than words. "You want to learn, don't you?" Amadou asked, his voice both gentle and firm. Fatou nodded, unsure of how to express the depth of her desire. "I want to play the Kora," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I want to learn the stories, the songs, the music." Amadou studied her for a moment, his fingers stilling on the strings. "It is not an easy path," he warned. "The Kora speaks with the wisdom of generations. It does not simply obey the hands, it requires the soul." Fatou's eyes shone with determination. "I will learn, no matter what it takes." Amadou paused, a slow smile forming on his lips. "Then come," he said, motioning for her to sit beside him. "Let us begin." As Fatou sat beside him, the sounds of the Kora began to feel like a bridge between her dreams and reality. The moment she placed her hands on the strings, something stirred deep within her. She had taken the first step towards something much greater than she could ever have imagined. Chapter 3. The First Lesson. Fatou sat next to Amadou, feeling the warmth of the sun as it filtered through the trees. The sound of the Kora was like nothing she had ever heard up close. It was as if the instrument was alive, speaking a language that only those truly dedicated to its craft could understand. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the strings. Amadou watched her closely, sensing her nervousness, but also the raw potential within her. "The Kora is not just an instrument," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It is the voice of our ancestors, the heartbeat of our culture. To play it, you must listen not just with your ears, but with your heart." He placed his hands gently over hers, guiding her fingers to the correct position on the strings. Fatou's heart pounded as she touched the kora for the first time. The strings were tight under her fingers, and the notes sounded awkward, lacking the grace and fluidity that Amadou's music had. But she didn't mind. This was just the beginning. Amadou patiently guided her through the basic plucking technique, showing her how to create the right pressure on the strings and allowing the sound to flow naturally. The first few attempts were clumsy, and Fatou felt a wave of frustration rising within her. She had imagined herself playing beautifully right from the start, but reality was much more difficult. "Do not be discouraged," Amadou said, sensing her frustration. "Every note you play, no matter how imperfect, brings you closer to understanding the music. Remember, the kora does not judge. It accepts you for who you are, with all your flaws." Fatou took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and tried again. This time, the sound was a little smoother, though still far from the perfect melody she had envisioned. But Amadou nodded with approval. "That is better," he said. "You are listening. Now, let us build the music together." The lesson continued for hours, and by the end of the day, Fatou's fingers were sore, but her heart felt fuller. She had taken her first step on a long journey. Amadou's words echoed in her mind. The kora speaks with the wisdom of generations. Fatou knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready for the challenge. Chapter 4: Unspoken Bonds. As the days passed, Fatou and Amadou's lessons continued. They met daily under the shade of the baobab tree by the river, where the music of Mali seemed to blend with the flow of the water. Fatou's skill with the kora slowly improved, though it was still far from the level of mastery that Amadou displayed with such ease. But with every passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. Fatou found herself drawn not just to the music, but to the wisdom that Amadou carried. He was more than just a griot. He was a living archive of Mali's history and culture, a man who had dedicated his life to preserving the old songs and stories. The way he spoke about the past, about the ancestors, the kings and queens, the warriors and the lovers, made Fatou feel as though she had been given a glimpse into another world, a world of profound beauty and ancient truths. As they played together, their music began to take on a life of its own. Sometimes, when Fatou was struggling with a particularly difficult piece, Amadou would play a slow, soothing melody, allowing her to feel the rhythm before attempting to replicate it. The more they played, the more they shared not only the music but also the stories behind each note. One evening, after a particularly emotional lesson, Amadou looked at Fatou with a kind smile. "You are learning more than just the kora," he said softly. "You are learning how to listen to the stories of your ancestors. And one day, you will tell them yourself." Fatou felt a rush of emotion. The music, the lessons, and the wisdom were beginning to weave themselves into something much larger than she had imagined. She wasn't just learning an instrument. She was learning to carry a legacy. Chapter 5: The Strain of Tradition. The sun was setting over Bamako, casting a warm golden glow on the dusty streets, as Fatou sat under the baobab tree, her fingers aching from another intense practice session with Amadou. The melody she was attempting to play was a difficult one, an ancient song passed down through generations of griots. Fatou's mind was filled with the notes, but her body struggled to keep up. The path she had chosen was not an easy one, and with each lesson, the weight of her decision began to feel heavier. It wasn't just the difficulty of the kora that weighed on her mind, it was the pressure of her community's expectations. Though Fatou was determined to master the instrument, the people around her didn't share her enthusiasm. Her mother, in particular, disapproved of the amount of time Fatou spent with Amadou. She often questioned why Fatou needed to pursue music, something that was typically reserved for men in their society. "You should be focused on other things, Fatou," her mother would say, her voice filled with concern. "Your future is in the home, not in music." Fatou often found herself torn between her love for the kora and the expectations placed on her as a woman. Every time she returned home after a lesson with Amadou, she could feel her mother's disapproving gaze following her, a silent reminder of the world she was challenging. But Fatou's love for the music, for the stories it carried, burned brighter than ever. She refused to let anyone dictate her path. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold if she continued to defy tradition. Would she ever be accepted? Would her mother ever understand? Amadou, sensing her inner conflict, offered some words of wisdom during their next lesson. Tradition is a heavy cloak, Fatou. It keeps you warm, but it can also suffocate you. Only you can decide whether to wear it or shed it. Fatou listened closely, the weight of his words settling into her heart. Amadou was right. Tradition could protect her, but it could also hold her back. As she picked up the Kora again, she resolved that no matter the struggle, she would continue her journey. She would carve her own path, even if it meant defying the expectations of those she loved. Chapter 6: The First Test. As the weeks passed, Fatou's playing improved, though it was still far from perfect. She spent every waking moment practicing the Kora, her fingers calloused and her body weary, but she felt an undeniable pull to keep going. Amadou had taught her more than just the mechanics of playing. He had shown her how to bring emotion into the music, to feel the pulse of the song deep in her soul. One afternoon, as they were finishing their lesson, Amadou turned to her with a serious expression. "There is a festival coming up," he said. "It is one of the most important celebrations in our community. The griots will perform, and people from all over the region will gather to hear the music." Fatou's heart skipped a beat. The festival was an event she had always watched from the sidelines, admiring the griots who performed with such grace and power. But to perform at the festival, to be counted among them, was something few women ever dared to do. "You should play, Fatou," Amadou said, as if reading her thoughts. "It will be your test. You will see how far you have come and whether you are truly ready to carry the stories of our ancestors." Fatou hesitated. The idea of performing in front of so many people was terrifying. She had barely begun to master the Kora, and the thought of standing before the community, playing the music of her people, seemed like an impossible challenge. What if she failed? What if her playing wasn't good enough? Amadou seemed to sense her doubt. "You have already passed the hardest test," he said gently. "You have dared to follow your passion, to break free from the constraints of tradition. That is something no one can take from you." Despite her fear, Fatou knew this was a pivotal moment in her journey. She had come too far to turn back now. "I will play," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness that gripped her. "I will play at the festival." Amadou smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "Then let us prepare." Chapter 7: The Weight of Expectations. As the festival drew closer, the pressure on Fatou intensified. Her mother's disapproval weighed heavily on her, and the elders of the village whispered about her decision to defy tradition. It was one thing for a man to perform at the festival, but a woman? It was unheard of. Fatou's resolve was tested daily as she continued to practice the Kora, her fingers moving over the strings with increasing precision. But every note she played felt like it was echoing her doubts. Was she doing the right thing? Was it worth it to go against everything her community believed in? The day before the festival, Fatou visited her mother, hoping to find some reassurance. She sat in the small hut they called home, her mother's stern eyes never leaving her face. "Fatou, why are you doing this?" her mother asked, her voice thick with worry. "You are a woman. Your place is with your family, not in front of a crowd. What will people say about you? What will they think of our family?" Fatou struggled to find the words to explain her passion, her need to follow her heart. "I don't want to be like everyone else," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to be true to myself. Music is in my soul, Mama. It is not just a dream. It is my calling." Her mother's face softened, but the concern never left her eyes. "I only want what is best for you, Fatou. But I fear you are heading down a path that will bring you nothing but pain." Fatou left her mother's hut with a heavy heart, knowing the rift between them had deepened. But she also knew that she could not give up on her dream. She would play at the festival, and whatever the outcome, she would face it with courage. Chapter 8: The Festival Begins. The morning of the festival arrived, and Fatou woke up early, her heart racing with excitement and fear. The entire village had gathered, the air filled with the vibrant buzz of preparations. Stalls selling colorful fabrics, handmade jewelry, and delicious street food lined the streets, and the sound of drumming echoed through the air. But despite the festivities, Fatou could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was more than just a festival. It was her chance to prove herself, to show her community that she, too, had a place in the world of music. She stood before the mirror in her small room, adjusting the bright yellow scarf that covered her hair. Her reflection seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. The woman staring back at her was not just Fatou from the village. She was someone who had dared to challenge the rules, someone who had taken a step into the unknown. "Are you ready?" Amadou's voice broke through her thoughts as he entered the room, carrying the Kora. Fatou turned to face him, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know if I am," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Amadou smiled gently and handed her the instrument. "You are ready. You have been ready from the moment you picked up the Kora." His words gave her strength, but her nerves remained. She had practiced tirelessly, but the fear of failure loomed over her. What if I make a mistake? What if the crowd doesn't accept me? Amadou's eyes were kind, but firm. "The music is not for the crowd, Fatou. It is for you, for the ancestors, and for the stories we carry. Play from your heart. Everything else will follow." Fatou nodded, though a sense of unease still lingered in her chest. Together, they walked toward the open-air stage set up in the center of the village, where the griots were already preparing. The crowd was beginning to gather, their excited chatter filling the air. Fatou's eyes scanned the faces around her. Her mother was standing near the back, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Fatou swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. Amadou motioned for her to sit beside him, and she did so, her fingers instinctively touching the strings of the Kora. The sounds were gentle at first, just a soft hum to accompany the conversation around them. But as the musicians began to tune their instruments, the energy of the festival seemed to grow, and with it, Fatou's anticipation. Chapter 9. The First Note. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the village, the festival officially began. Drummers began to beat their rhythms, filling the air with a pulse that seemed to echo in Fatou's chest. She could feel the vibrations of the drums in her very bones, a reminder of the deep connection between music and the soul of Mali. The griots performed first, their songs rich with history, stories of ancient kings and warriors, of love and betrayal. Fatou watched in awe, her heart swelling with pride for her culture and its traditions. When it was finally her turn, Amadou gave her an encouraging nod, his hand resting on her shoulder. Fatou took a deep breath, her fingers poised over the strings of the Kora. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the first note. Fatou closed her eyes, centering herself, listening to the rhythmic heartbeat of the village around her. She could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant sound of the river flowing, the chatter of the crowd. Everything seemed to fade away as she focused on the music within her. With a deep breath, she began to play. The first note was shaky, but as the melody continued, Fatou's confidence grew. Her fingers moved more fluidly across the strings, creating a sound that resonated with the people around her. The chorus sang a story, one that was not bound by the old rules of gender or tradition. It was her own story, one of defiance, hope, and the power of following one's passion. Amadou played alongside her, guiding her as they wove the song together. The crowd, initially unsure, began to lean in, listening intently. Fatou's heart swelled with pride as the music took on a life of its own, filling the air with its rich, melodic sounds. It was as if the Kora was speaking the words that Fatou had been too afraid to say, telling the story of a young woman's journey to break free from the chains of tradition. For the first time, Fatou felt truly seen. She wasn't just a woman playing an instrument. She was a griot in her own right, sharing the stories of her people, her culture, and herself. As the final note echoed into the night, the crowd erupted in applause. Chapter 10. A Moment of Victory. As the last notes of Fatou's performance faded into the evening air, the crowd sat in stunned silence for a moment before the applause began. It was slow at first, hesitant, as if the people were unsure of what they had just witnessed. But soon, the applause grew louder, filling the space around Fatou and Amadou. She could hardly believe it. The overwhelming sound of the crowd's approval was more than she had ever hoped for. Fatou's heart raced, but this time, it was with joy, not fear. She had done it. She had played, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever doubted her. The weight of her mother's disapproval and the whispers of the community seemed to melt away in that moment. Fatou had carved out a space for herself in the world of music, and the applause she received was the validation she needed to know that she was on the right path. Amadou placed a hand on her shoulder, his smile wide with pride. "You did it, Fatou," he said. "You played from your heart. The music spoke for you." Fatou smiled back, tears welling in her eyes. She had always dreamed of this moment, but now that it had arrived, it felt even more incredible than she had imagined. She had faced her fears, defied the expectations of her community, and proven that women, too, could be griots, musicians, and storytellers. As the crowd continued to cheer, Fatou's eyes found her mother in the back of the crowd. Her face was still uncertain, but there was something different in her gaze, perhaps a flicker of pride. Fatou's heart swelled with hope. One day, she knew her mother would understand. Chapter 11. The Seeds of Change. After Fatou's performance at the festival, the village seemed to buzz with conversation. The elders, who had been skeptical of her decision to play the Kora, now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some had seen her performance as a bold step, while others viewed it as an act of rebellion. But Fatou was undeterred. She had played her heart out, and the music had spoken for itself. Back at home, her mother remained distant, her disapproval still lingering in the air. But Fatou noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her mother no longer outright condemned her passion for music, though she said little about the performance. Instead, there was a quiet contemplation in her eyes, as though she were wrestling with the new reality that her daughter was not the same girl who had once obeyed every rule set before her. The next day, as Fatou sat by the river, practicing on her Kora, she was interrupted by a familiar voice. It was Amadou, carrying his own Kora with him. He had come to check on her progress and offer more lessons. "You played beautifully last night," Amadou said, sitting beside her. "I could see the change in you, Fatou. Your music was more than just notes. It was a story, a piece of your soul." Fatou smiled, grateful for his kind words. "It felt like everything I've ever wanted to say just came out through the strings," she admitted. "But I can't help feeling like there's more to this than just playing the Kora. I want to make a difference. I want to inspire other women, like me, to follow their dreams." Amadou nodded, his face thoughtful. "You already have, Fatou. Your performance last night was a step forward, not just for you, but for all the women who are told they can't do something simply because they are women. You've planted a seed, and now it's up to you to water it." Fatou looked out over the river, her heart swelling with a new sense of purpose. She hadn't just played at the festival for herself. She had done it for all the women who had been told they were not enough. She would continue to break barriers and challenge the norms, one note at a time. Chapter 12. The Changing Tide. The days that followed the festival were a whirlwind of emotions for Fatou. Everywhere she went, she was met with whispers, some filled with admiration, others laced with doubt. The elders in her village, who had once disapproved of her ambition, now seemed to watch her with a mix of respect and wariness. Fatou was no longer just the quiet girl who tended to her family's needs. She had become a symbol of change, and with that came both admiration and suspicion. Her mother, however, remained unchanged. She had not spoken much since the festival, and Fatou could feel the tension between them growing. The village's traditional values were still deeply rooted in her mother's heart, and no matter how much Fatou had achieved, it would be difficult for her mother to embrace a future where her daughter was a Kora player, a griot, a woman who defied convention. One afternoon, Fatou found herself sitting at the foot of the baobab tree, lost in thought. She was unsure how to navigate the growing rift with her mother. The woman who had once been her greatest supporter now seemed distant and disconnected from her dreams. Fatou longed for her mother's approval, but she also knew that the path she had chosen might never fully align with her mother's expectations. Amadou's voice broke through her thoughts. "Fatou, you must remember that change takes time," he said, sitting beside her. "Your mother may not understand today, but that doesn't mean she never will. You've already taken a giant step, and now it's up to you to keep walking." Fatou sighed. "I don't know if I can keep going without her understanding. It hurts that she's not proud of me." Amadou placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Pride is something that grows, like a tree. It doesn't happen overnight, but it will come. Keep playing, keep showing her what you can do. In time, she'll see." Fatou nodded, grateful for his support. She had come so far already, and she wasn't about to stop now. Chapter 13. The First Steps Towards Change. Despite the uncertainty that clouded her relationship with her mother, Fatou remained focused on her music. Her performance at the festival had sparked something inside her, a fire that refused to die. She practiced daily, pushing herself to master new pieces and refine her technique. Amadou continued to mentor her, offering guidance and encouragement, but Fatou knew that the real journey was just beginning. One day, as she walked through the village market, Fatou overheard a conversation between two women. They were discussing the festival and Fatou's performance, and to her surprise, they spoke with admiration. "Did you see Fatou play?" one of the women asked. "She was amazing. I've never seen a woman perform like that. It's a shame we don't see more women picking up the Kora. Maybe it's time for things to change." Fatou's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that her performance could have a lasting impact, but to hear other women talking about it with such admiration made her realize just how much power music had to shift perspectives. Encouraged by this small but significant moment, Fatou began to think more seriously about her future. If she could inspire even one woman to pick up an instrument or follow her dreams, she knew she was on the right path. She would not stop now. Amadou's words echoed in her mind. "You've planted a seed." Fatou realized that her journey was not just about music. It was about challenging the boundaries that had been set for women like her. She would not be the last. More women would follow in her footsteps, and together, they would change the landscape of their society. Chapter 14. The Call for Change. As Fatou's music continued to touch the hearts of those around her, a new idea began to take root in her mind. She had always believed in the power of music to tell stories, to change hearts and minds. But what if there was a way to harness this power on a larger scale? What if she could create a space where women could come together, share their stories, and play music freely, without the constraints of tradition? Fatou began to plan. She dreamed of starting a music school for women, a place where they could learn the kora, the djem, and other traditional instruments, a place where they could express themselves and share their voices with the world. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be welcomed by everyone, but Fatou knew it was time to take action. With Amadou's help, she began to reach out to other women in the village, speaking to them about her vision. Some were hesitant, unsure of whether it was possible to break free from the traditional roles that had been assigned to them, but others were intrigued. Fatou could see the spark in their eyes as they listened to her words. They, too, had dreams, and they, too, wanted to create something new. One evening, after a long day of talking to the women, Fatou sat with Amadou, reflecting on everything she had accomplished. "You've started something, Fatou," Amadou said, his voice filled with pride. "You've planted a seed, and it's growing." Fatou smiled. "I hope it's a tree that will provide shade for generations to come." Chapter 15. Resistance. As Fatou's idea for a music school began to take shape, she encountered resistance that she hadn't fully anticipated. The elders in the village, particularly the men, were not as welcoming of her plans as the women were. They viewed her project as an unnecessary rebellion, a challenge to the traditional roles they had worked so hard to preserve. They feared that if women were allowed to learn the kora and other instruments, it would disrupt the delicate balance of their culture. One afternoon, as Fatou was walking through the village, she was approached by a group of men. They were elders of the village, their faces stern as they spoke to her. "Fatou, we've heard about your plans," one of the men said. "A woman playing the kora is already unusual, But teaching other women to do the same? That's a step too far. Fatou stood tall, her heart pounding, but she refused to be intimidated. Music belongs to everyone, regardless of gender. Why should women be denied the right to express themselves? We are as capable as any man. The elder shook his head. You are forgetting your place, Fatou. Women have their roles in the home, in the family. Music is for the men, the griots who carry our history. It is not for women to take on. Fatou's heart sank, but she did not back down. Times are changing. I will not let your traditions hold me back. The men exchanged looks, clearly disapproving of her defiance. We will not support your school, Fatou. If you go through with it, you will do so without the blessing of the village. Fatou walked away, her mind racing with frustration. She had known that change would not come easily, but hearing the elder's words stung deeply. Despite the resistance, she knew she had to keep going. The music school was her dream, and it was bigger than the small-minded prejudices of a few.
She would not stop now.
Chapter 16. Finding Allies. In the days following her confrontation with the elders, Fatou found herself discouraged. The support she had been receiving from the women was encouraging, but without the backing of the village's influential leaders, it felt like an uphill battle. She spent hours sitting by the river, contemplating whether it was worth continuing. She knew the risks. She could lose the respect of her family, her community, and the elders. But deep down, she felt that this was the right path. It was during one of these moments of doubt that a familiar voice brought her back to her purpose. It was Amadou, walking toward her with a concerned look on his face. "Fatou, what is it?" he asked, sitting down beside her. She sighed, looking out at the water. "The elders, they've made it clear they do not approve of my plans. They think I'm overstepping my boundaries. I don't know if I can keep going if they continue to oppose me." Amadou listened quietly, understanding her frustration. "You've already done something incredible, Fatou. You've started the conversation. And it's not just the elders who will influence change. The village is made up of more than just them." Fatou turned to him, her expression uncertain. "What do you mean?" "The women in this village, the young girls, the musicians, you have allies, Fatou. Not everyone thinks the same way the elders do. You just have to find those who believe in what you're doing and build your support." Fatou's eyes brightened as she considered his words. She hadn't thought about it that way before. Perhaps the key was to build a network of allies, to find those who shared her vision and could help her push through the resistance. She stood up, a renewed sense of purpose filling her. "You're right, Amadou. I can't let a few voices stop me. There are others who will stand with me." Amadou smiled. "And I will stand with you. I will help you find them." Chapter 17. A New Beginning. Determined to move forward, Fatou set out to gather the support she needed. She reached out to the women who had been inspired by her performance at the festival, inviting them to meet and discuss the possibility of starting the music school together. At first, there was hesitation. Some feared the backlash, others worried about the logistics, but Fatou's passion was contagious. Slowly, the women began to see the power in her vision, and one by one, they agreed to join her cause. The first meeting was held in Fatou's home, where a small group of women gathered to discuss the future of the school. Fatou spoke passionately about the need for a space where women could learn and express themselves freely. She spoke of the stories that had been hidden, the voices that had been silenced for so long. "We are griots in our own right," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "We have stories to tell. We have songs to sing. And we deserve the right to do so." The women nodded in agreement, their faces lighting up with excitement. It was clear that Fatou's words had ignited something within them. The dream of the music school was no longer just Fatou's dream, it was theirs as well. The group decided to take the first step and organize a small concert, a gathering where they could showcase their music and invite the community to witness their talent. It was a bold move, but Fatou knew it was the right one. They would show the village that women could play the Kora, that they could share their stories, and that they were worthy of being seen and heard. Chapter 18. The Concert. The day of the concert arrived, and Fatou could feel the weight of the moment. The small courtyard where the performance was to take place had been decorated with colorful fabrics and lanterns. The women had practiced for weeks, each of them learning a different instrument or song, eager to show their community what they were capable of. Fatou stood backstage, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the strings of her Kora. Amadou had helped her prepare, offering guidance and encouragement, but the fear still lingered. What if the crowd didn't accept them? What if the elders were right? As the first few notes of the Kora filled the air, Fatou's nerves began to settle. The sound of the music was familiar, comforting, and soon she was lost in the rhythm, playing alongside the other women. The crowd began to gather, hesitant at first, but slowly drawn in by the beauty of the music. There were whispers, of course, some of the older women muttering disapprovingly, but there were also younger girls in the crowd, their eyes wide with wonder. The performance was a success. Fatou and the women had created something magical, something that transcended the boundaries that had been set before them. The music spoke for itself, and for a brief moment, Fatou felt the weight of all her struggles lift. She had proven, if only for that evening, that women could break free from tradition and make their voices heard. Chapter 19: The Aftermath. In the days following the concert, the village was abuzz with conversation. Some people were impressed by the performance, while others were still resistant to the idea of women taking on the role of griots. Fatou could feel the tension in the air, but she was determined not to let it discourage her. Her mother, though still silent, seemed to soften. She had attended the concert, though she had not said a word to Fatou about it afterward. Fatou wasn't sure what her mother was thinking, but she hoped that in time, she would come to understand. Amadou visited Fatou after the concert, his face filled with pride. "You did it," he said. "You showed them all what women are capable of." Fatou smiled, but the joy was tempered by the realization that there was still much work to be done. The music school was just the beginning. The path ahead was long, and there would be more challenges, more resistance. But Fatou was ready. She had the support of the women in the village, and together, they would continue to break down the barriers that held them back. Chapter 20: A Hard Decision. The days following the concert were filled with mixed emotions. Fatou had received messages of support from several young girls and women in the village, but there were also murmurs of disapproval from the elders. Some of the older women who had attended the performance in silence began to speak openly, questioning whether the music school would be worth the trouble. Despite this, Fatou was unwavering. But soon, an unexpected decision came from her family. Her father, who had always been a quiet observer of the village's traditions, called her into his study one evening. His face was stern, and Fatou could tell from his eyes that this conversation would not be easy. "Fatou," he began, "I've heard the gossip. Your concert has sparked quite a stir in the village. People are talking some good, some bad. Your mother and I are concerned." Fatou's heart began to race, but she kept her composure. "What is it, father?" He looked down at the table for a long moment before speaking again. "You know we value tradition in this family. We've always upheld the customs that have been passed down through the generations. This music school, this rebellion against tradition, it's unsettling." Her father's words stung, but Fatou knew what was coming. Her family had always expected her to conform, to follow the path that had been laid out for her. But Fatou couldn't turn back now. Her dream was too important. "I understand, father," she said quietly. "But I believe this is the right thing to do. I want to create a space where women can be heard, where they can share their stories through music." Her father's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "You have a choice, Fatou. You can continue down this path, but it will come at a cost. If you choose this, you will have to face the consequences. Your mother and I may not support you. The village may turn its back on you." Fatou felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had always valued her family's support, but now she had to choose between that support and the pursuit of her dream. She looked into her father's eyes and made up her mind. "I am ready to face the consequences," she said, her voice steady. "I will not give up on this." Her father sighed deeply. "Then you must be prepared, Fatou. This is not an easy road. But I will not stop you. You are an adult, and the decision is yours." Chapter 21: A Quiet Rebellion. The next few weeks were a blur of determination and doubt. Fatou continued to meet with the women who had agreed to join her music school, and they worked tirelessly to prepare for their next performance. They spent hours each day practicing the Kora, learning new songs, and rehearsing their routines. The energy in the group was contagious, and Fatou felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had chosen this path, and nothing would stop her. Amadou was there every step of the way, offering advice and encouragement. He saw the fire in Fatou's eyes, and he knew that she would not rest until her dream became a reality. His faith in her never wavered. But as Fatou spent more time with her new allies, the tension between her and her family grew. Her mother, who had once been supportive of her musical endeavors, began to withdraw, and Fatou could feel the coldness between them. Her father, while still offering her the freedom to pursue her dreams, could not hide his disappointment. The village's disapproval weighed heavily on her, and she often found herself questioning whether it was worth it. Still, Fatou pressed on. She knew that this was more than just about her. It was about every woman who had ever been silenced, every girl who had been told that her voice didn't matter. The music school was not just a dream, it was a movement. And Fatou was its leader. Chapter 22: The Power of Music. Fatou's music school began to take shape. With the help of her allies, she was able to secure a small building on the outskirts of the village, a place where the women could gather to practice and learn in peace. The space was modest, but it was a start. Slowly, more and more women began to join, some eager to learn, others just curious to see what Fatou was up to. The first class was small, but it was a victory nonetheless. Amadou came by often to help the women with their playing, offering his wisdom and guidance. He was amazed at how quickly the women took to the instruments, their passion and determination driving them to master the Kora in ways he hadn't expected. Fatou could see the joy in their eyes as they played, and she knew that they were creating something beautiful, something that would change their lives forever. As the weeks went by, the group grew stronger. The women began to form bonds, supporting one another as they navigated the challenges of learning music in a society that still viewed them as inferior. They shared stories of their struggles, their triumphs, and their dreams. Through their music, they found their voices. One evening, as the group was finishing their practice, Fatou stood at the front of the room, watching the women play. A sense of pride washed over her. She had created something meaningful, something that had the power to change the world. "Keep playing," she whispered to herself. "This is only the beginning." Chapter 23: The Test. Fatou's music school was beginning to flourish, but with success came new challenges. The elders in the village, particularly those who had been most vocal in their disapproval, began to grow more aggressive in their opposition. They saw the school as a direct threat to their authority and the traditions they had worked so hard to preserve. One evening, as Fatou was leaving the school after a particularly long practice session, she was confronted by two of the elders. They stood in her path, their expressions cold and stern. "Fatou," one of the men said, his voice low, "we've tolerated your rebellion for long enough. This music school of yours is an affront to everything we stand for. You are bringing shame to this village." Fatou stood tall, refusing to show fear. "I am not ashamed of what I am doing. I am proud of my music, proud of what we are building here. And I will not stop." The elder shook his head. "You may not stop, but we will. If you continue down this path, we will make sure your school is shut down. You will have no support from the village." Fatou's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "You can try, but we will not be silenced." The elder narrowed his eyes. "You have been warned." As they walked away, Fatou knew that the battle was far from over. But she was ready. She had come too far to give up now. Chapter 24: The Gathering Storm. The tension between Fatou and the elders continued to grow. As her music school became more established, the resistance from the village's traditionalists intensified. Rumors spread that the school was becoming a symbol of defiance, a challenge to the deeply ingrained customs that govern their lives. The elders began to rally those who still held fast to tradition, organizing meetings to discuss the threat Fatou posed. Amadou, sensing the brewing storm, advised Fatou to be cautious. "There is power in unity, Fatou. he said one evening as they sat together under the shade of a baobab tree. But there is also danger in division. The elders will not back down easily.
Fatou knew he was right.
The path she had chosen was not without its risks, and the cost of pursuing her dream was becoming clearer with each passing day. The village was divided, and the pressure to conform weighed heavily on her heart. Yet, the women who had gathered at her school looked to her for guidance, their faces filled with hope. Fatou knew she could not let them down. One evening, a group of women from the school came to her with a plan. They had heard that the village was organizing a council meeting to discuss the future of the music school, and they wanted to attend, to show their support for Fatou and the school. It was a bold move, one that could easily backfire. But Fatou saw the resolve in their eyes and knew that this was their chance to stand together. She agreed to attend, and they began to prepare. Fatou worked with Amadou to write a speech, one that would speak to the heart of the village's elders, urging them to see the value in what she was doing. They practiced together, refining the words, making sure every sentence carried the weight of her belief in the power of music to unite and uplift. Chapter 25. The Council Meeting. The day of the council meeting arrived, and Fatou could feel the weight of the moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the gathered elders, their stern faces looking down at her from their seats. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Yet, she stood tall, her resolve unwavering. The room was silent as Fatou stepped forward, Amadou by her side. The elders exchanged wary glances, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. Fatou's mother, who had come along for support, sat in the back of the room, her eyes filled with both pride and concern. "Honorable elders," Fatou began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand before you today not as a rebel, but as a daughter of this village. I understand the importance of our traditions, but I also believe that we must evolve, that we must create new spaces for our voices to be heard." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was heavy, but Fatou pressed on. "Music has always been a part of our culture, but it has been exclusive. It has been a space for men. I am asking for the chance to change that, to create a space where women can express themselves, where they can share their stories and their struggles through music." Her words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Fatou's heart raced as she waited for a response. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one of the elders spoke. "Fatou, you speak of evolution, but what you propose goes against the very fabric of our community. You are asking us to abandon our values, our way of life. We cannot allow this." Fatou's stomach twisted with disappointment, but she refused to back down. "I am not asking you to abandon anything. I am asking you to allow us the freedom to contribute, the freedom to create something new, something that honors our past while embracing the future." There was a long pause, and Fatou could feel the tension in the room. The elders looked at each other, whispering among themselves. Fatou's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. After what seemed like an eternity, the eldest of the council members, a man whose face was as weathered as the land itself, spoke again. "This will not be easy, Fatou. But perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is time for change." Chapter 26. A New Beginning. Fatou's heart leapt in her chest as she heard the elders' words. It was not a complete victory, but it was a start. The council had agreed to allow the music school to continue, but with certain conditions. The school would need to be integrated more closely with the community, and the women would be required to perform for the village during special events, showcasing their talent and honoring the traditions of the village. It was a compromise, but it was a step forward. Fatou knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope. The battle was not over, but the doors had been opened. Amadou was the first to congratulate her after the meeting. "You did it, Fatou," he said, his eyes sparkling with pride. "You've made them listen." Fatou smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead. There was still so much work to be done. She had to continue building the school, continuing to gather support, and most importantly, She had to prove that the music school could be both a celebration of tradition and a platform for change. The road ahead was long, but Fatou was ready. She had made it this far, and she knew that with her passion, her music, and the support of the women who stood by her, she could change the world, one note at a time. Chapter 27. The First Performance. Fatou's music school was starting to feel like a true community. The women who had joined were no longer just students. They had become sisters in a shared dream. Every day, the school filled with the sound of music, a blend of Kora strings and voices. They were creating something beautiful, something that could not be ignored. The day of their first public performance arrived, and Fatou could feel the weight of the moment. This would be their chance to prove themselves, to show the village that they were not simply defying tradition, but adding to it. It was a chance to show that women, too, could be part of the legacy of music in Mali. The venue was a small outdoor space in the heart of the village, a place where weddings and festivals were often held. The audience consisted of both supporters and skeptics, the younger generation mixed with the older, those who had come to see if the women could truly play, and those who had come to judge. Fatou stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. Amadou was by her side, offering quiet words of encouragement. "You've trained them well, Fatou," he said with a smile. "This is your moment." The women lined up, ready to take their places on stage. Fatou took her seat, her hands trembling as she adjusted the Kora strings. She looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of the elders, some of them still skeptical, others watching with curiosity. Then, as the first notes filled the air, something magical happened. The sound of the Kora, the rhythm of the voices, the harmony of the instruments, it was a powerful blend of tradition and innovation. The music flowed like a river, strong and unyielding, carrying with it the stories and dreams of every woman in the village. The audience was silent at first, listening intently, but as the performance continued, they began to nod in appreciation. The women's confidence grew, their music becoming more and more powerful. By the end of the performance, the crowd erupted in applause. Fatou's heart soared as she looked around. The women were beaming, their faces lit up with pride. They had done it. They had proven themselves. Chapter 28. Unexpected Support. After the performance, the village was abuzz with conversation. Word spread quickly about the remarkable performance the women had given. Even some of the more traditional elders who had been skeptical before now saw the value in what Fatou was doing. It wasn't just the music, it was the unity, the strength of the women, and the courage they had shown in the face of opposition. In the days that followed, Fatou began to receive unexpected support. Some of the younger men, who had once ridiculed the idea of a women's music school, approached her with offers to help. They recognized the power of music, and they saw the potential for the school to become something truly special. One day, a young man named Kofi came to the school with a proposal. He was a skilled drummer, and he wanted to teach the women how to incorporate drumming into their performances. "We can create a fusion of instruments," he said, "something that combines the strength of the Kora with the rhythm of the drum. It will be something that no one has ever heard before." Fatou was intrigued by the idea, but she hesitated. The Kora was traditionally played alone, without accompaniment. The idea of adding drums was new and potentially controversial. "We can try," she said cautiously, "but we need to make sure that it respects our traditions." Kofi smiled, a look of determination in his eyes. "Trust me, Fatou. We will honor the traditions, but we will also push the boundaries. Together, we can create something beautiful." Fatou agreed, and the following weeks were filled with experimentation. The women learned the rhythms of the drums, blending them with the delicate sound of the Kora. It was challenging at first, as the two instruments had never been played together in this way, but slowly, they began to find a rhythm, a harmony that was uniquely their own. Chapter 29. The Village Festival. The village's annual festival was just around the corner, and Fatou knew that this would be their biggest test yet. The festival was a time for the entire village to come together, to celebrate their traditions, and to showcase the talents of the community. This year, Fatou's music school had been invited to perform. It was a great honor, but it also meant that the women would be under the spotlight. The weeks leading up to the festival were filled with rehearsals. Fatou and the women worked tirelessly, perfecting their new sound. The drumming had added a new layer to their music, and they were eager to share it with the village. But with the excitement came the pressure. Fatou could feel the weight of expectation on her shoulders. This was their chance to prove that the music school was more than just a passing rebellion. It was something that could change the future of their village. On the day of the festival, the air was thick with anticipation. The women were dressed in vibrant traditional clothing, their faces shining with excitement. As they took the stage, Fatou's heart raced. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new. The elders were seated at the front, their eyes fixed on the stage, their expressions unreadable. Fatou took a deep breath and nodded to Amadou. The music began. The fusion of the Kora and drums was mesmerizing. The rhythm of the drumbeat intertwined with the delicate strings of the Kora, creating a sound that was both ancient and modern, traditional and new. The audience sat in stunned silence at first, but as the music grew louder, more intense, they began to move. Some nodded their heads, others tapped their feet, and by the end of the performance, the entire crowd was on their feet, applauding. For Fatou, it was a moment of pure joy. The women had done it. They had not only survived the challenges they faced, but they had also created something truly unique. The music was a reflection of their strength, their unity, and their defiance. It was a victory, not just for Fatou, but for every woman who had ever been told that her voice didn't matter. Chapter 30. The Turning Tide. In the days that followed the festival, the mood in the village shifted. What had once been skepticism and disapproval slowly transformed into admiration. The elders, though still cautious, began to acknowledge the power of Fatou's music school. The women had not only brought joy to the village through their performance, they had also proved that they could respect tradition while forging their own path.
Fatou could feel the change.
The whispers of disapproval had faded, replaced by conversations about the future of the music school. There was still work to be done, still resistance to overcome, but Fatou knew that they had made a lasting impact. She had created a space where women could be heard, where they could share their music and their stories, and that was something no one could take away. Chapter 31. The Unseen Challenges. Despite the growing acceptance of the music school, not all challenges had been conquered. Fatou found that as the school's reputation grew, so too did the expectations. The women who had once been part of a small, intimate group now had a larger audience, and with that came pressure. Their performances, once acts of personal expression, had become events to be scrutinized. Fatou noticed a change in the women's attitudes. Some were excited by the attention, while others felt overwhelmed. There were whispers of doubt among them, fears that they might not be able to meet the increasing expectations. Fatou, ever the leader, knew she had to guide them through this. Amadou, ever insightful, noticed Fatou's growing burden. One evening, as they walked together under the dimming sky, he spoke gently. "You carry too much on your shoulders, Fatou. Remember that leadership is not just about guiding others, but also about taking care of yourself. You must allow others to share the load." Fatou nodded, her mind already racing with the demands of the school. She had always been the one to shoulder the responsibilities, but now, more than ever, she needed to find a balance. The women needed her guidance, but they also needed space to grow on their own. She began to delegate more, allowing the women to take on leadership roles within the school. It was a difficult decision, but one that proved to be crucial. Slowly, the women began to find their own voices, their own sense of purpose in the music. The school became less about Fatou's vision and more about a collective effort, a shared dream that belonged to all of them. Chapter 32. A Fragile Peace. As Fatou focused on sharing the responsibility with her students, a fragile peace began to settle over the village. The once divided community, where the elders and younger generations clashed over the school, now began to come together. The performances had bridged a gap, and even those who had been the most resistant to change found themselves appreciating the music. But peace, as Fatou soon realized, is never permanent. Beneath the surface, tensions still simmered. While the younger generations celebrated the music school, the older generation remained cautious. The elders had agreed to allow the school to continue, but they still watched closely, wary of what the future might hold. Fatou knew that the road ahead would not be without obstacles. There would be more tests, more moments when her resolve would be challenged. But for now, the peace was enough. She had won a battle, and that victory had given her the strength to continue. Amadou, always her rock, reminded her of the importance of patience. "The winds of change blow slowly, Fatou," he said one day as they sat together in the shade of the baobab tree. "But they blow relentlessly.
Keep going.
The village will come to understand what you've created here." His words were a balm for Fatou's weary heart. She knew he was right. Change took time, and though the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, she was no longer walking it alone. Chapter 33. The Call to Expand. Months passed, and the music school continued to thrive. The women were performing more frequently, and each performance brought new support. Fatou found that her school had become a symbol of hope, not just for women, but for the entire village. People were starting to see music as a unifying force, something that could bring the community together in ways they had never imagined. One afternoon, as Fatou sat with Amadou and discussed the future of the school, he posed a question that had been on his mind for some time. "Fatou, have you thought about expanding? You've already achieved so much here. What if the music school could reach beyond this village, to others who could benefit from what you've created?" Fatou was taken aback by the suggestion. Expanding the school was a daunting prospect. The idea of traveling to other villages, of teaching women beyond her immediate circle, seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a huge leap, one that would require resources, time, and a great deal of planning. But as Amadou spoke of the possibilities, Fatou's heart began to race with excitement. There were so many women out there who could benefit from the same opportunity. The idea of creating a network of music schools, a movement that spanned the country, was a dream she had never fully entertained. The thought of leaving her village, of pushing beyond what she had already built, was daunting. But Fatou knew that she could not let fear hold her back. This was her chance to truly change the narrative, to create a legacy that would live on for generations. Chapter 34. The Journey Begins. Fatou's decision to expand the school was not made lightly. She spent days contemplating the logistics, how to recruit teachers, how to fund the expansion, and how to ensure that the schools would maintain the same spirit of unity and empowerment that she had created in her own village. It was a daunting task, but Fatou was no stranger to challenges. She knew that if she wanted to make a difference, she would have to take risks. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but she was determined to face them head-on. With Amadou's support, Fatou began to make plans. They reached out to other villages, spreading the word about the success of the music school and inviting women to join. It wasn't easy. There were still many who were skeptical, who believed that women should remain silent and hidden. But Fatou's reputation had already begun to spread, and the calls for change were growing louder. As the first few months passed, Fatou traveled from village to village, meeting women who were eager to learn, who were hungry for the opportunity to make music and share their stories. Each new school that opened was a victory, a testament to the power of perseverance and vision. Chapter 35. The First New School. The first new school Fatou established was in a village not far from her own, a place where women had long been discouraged from pursuing anything outside of traditional roles. The village elders were cautious, but they were willing to listen, especially after hearing the stories of the success in Fatou's village. They were reluctant, but curiosity about the music school grew among the younger generations. Fatou and Amadou arrived early in the morning, the air crisp with the freshness of dawn. The women who had been selected to start the school were gathered, eager to meet their new teacher and begin their journey into the world of music. Fatou could see the mixture of excitement and nervousness in their eyes. These women were taking a huge step, defying the conventions of their community, and Fatou could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. The first class began under a large tree in the village square, where the women were seated on woven mats. Fatou introduced herself and shared her story, explaining how she had become a Kora player and how the music school in her village had changed her life. She spoke not just of music, but of the power of self-expression and the importance of following one's dreams, regardless of societal expectations. As the lessons began, Fatou taught the women the basics of the Kora, guiding them through the delicate strings and rhythms. The women were tentative at first, their fingers fumbling over the strings, but with each passing day, their confidence grew. They were learning not only to play an instrument but also to find their voices in a world that had long silenced them. Chapter 36. The Resistance Grows. While Fatou was met with warm enthusiasm in many villages, there were still communities where the idea of a women's music school was met with outright resistance. The more successful the schools became, the more the traditionalists fought to maintain control over the old ways. There were whispers of rebellion, of plans to shut down the schools, of efforts to convince the women that they were walking a dangerous path. One evening, Fatou received a letter from a group of elders in a distant village, requesting her presence for a meeting. They were not pleased with the growing popularity of her music schools, and they had made their intentions clear. They wanted her to cease expanding the school and return to the traditional ways. Fatou knew that this meeting would not be easy. She gathered Amadou and the other teachers who had helped her along the way, and they made the journey to the village, where a heated confrontation awaited them. The elders sat in a circle, their faces stern and unyielding. Fatou stood before them, feeling the weight of their gazes. "We respect your traditions," she began, "but we believe that the future of our people lies in change. Music is not a male-dominated art. Women have just as much right to it as men." The discussion that followed was intense. The elders argued that the traditions of their ancestors should not be tampered with. They insisted that women's roles were in the home, not on the stage. Fatou listened carefully, but her resolve did not waver. She spoke of the many women who had found strength through music, of how it had changed their lives and brought unity to the community. In the end, the elders did not accept her arguments, but they could not silence her either. Fatou left the meeting knowing that she had planted a seed. She had challenged their beliefs, and though the road ahead would be difficult, she had made a stand. Chapter 37. The Influence Spreads. Despite the resistance in certain areas, Fatou's influence continued to spread. With each new school she established, more and more women came forward, eager to learn. Word of the women's music schools spread beyond the villages, reaching cities and towns where the idea of women playing music was still met with disdain. Fatou's efforts were being recognized in places she had never imagined. She received letters from women in far-off towns, asking for guidance on starting their own schools. Fatou knew that she could not do it all on her own, but she began to form a network of like-minded women who could carry the torch forward in other regions. Amadou, who had been with her since the beginning, stood by her side, helping with the logistics and planning. He was proud of what they had achieved, but he also saw the toll it was taking on Fatou. She was stretched thin, always on the move, always working to keep the schools running smoothly. One night, as they sat by a fire, Amadou spoke gently. "Fatou, you've built something incredible here. But you can't keep going at this pace forever. You need to take time for yourself, to rest." Fatou smiled softly, but she knew he was right. The journey had been long, and it was far from over. She had built something that was changing lives, but if she didn't take care of herself, she wouldn't be able to continue her work. Chapter 38. The Vision of the Future. Fatou knew that the music school was not just a dream, it was a movement. The women she had taught, the communities she had touched, were all part of something much larger than herself. She had created a space where women could be seen, heard, and respected, and now she had to ensure that this vision would continue long after she was gone. With Amadou's help, she began to work on a plan for the future, a plan that would ensure the sustainability of the schools and continue to inspire future generations. She knew that her work could never truly be finished, but she wanted to leave behind a legacy that would continue to grow and evolve. In the coming months, Fatou began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the school, trusting the women she had mentored to take on greater responsibilities. She focused on training new leaders, women who could take the message of empowerment and music to even more villages and beyond. The future was uncertain, but Fatou was more determined than ever. She had built something beautiful, something that could not be undone. The music school had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could happen when women defied the odds and followed their dreams. Chapter 39. A Challenge from Within. As Fatou began stepping back from the day-to-day operations, she encountered a new challenge, one that came from within the schools themselves. The women who had once looked up to her as a mentor now found themselves questioning their place in the growing movement. Some were eager to take on leadership roles, while others felt unsure of their abilities. Fatou realized that her withdrawal from the immediate responsibilities had left a gap, and that gap was starting to widen. One of the most vocal critics was Mariama, a gifted Kora player who had risen through the ranks and was now teaching in one of the newer schools. She admired Fatou, but she also felt a growing sense of frustration. "You taught us to be leaders, Fatou, but now it feels like you're abandoning us. We need your guidance, your presence, now more than ever." Fatou listened patiently, knowing that Mariama's words were not just about her absence, but also about the pressure that the new schools brought. The students, the elders, and even the communities were all looking to the women for leadership, but Fatou had not prepared them fully for the weight of that responsibility. Fatou knew that she had to address this issue head-on. She organized a series of meetings with the teachers, the women who had become the backbone of the music school's expansion. Together, they discussed the challenges they faced, the internal conflicts that were brewing, and how they could support each other in maintaining the spirit of the school while adapting to its rapid growth. It was a difficult conversation, but one that needed to happen. Fatou realized that leadership was not just about teaching, it was about creating a network of support where the women could rely on each other and share the load. From that day forward, she committed to being more present, not in every classroom, but in a way that allowed the teachers to thrive in their own leadership roles while knowing they had her support. Chapter 40. A New Voice. As Fatou worked to rebuild her connection with the teachers, something beautiful began to emerge from within the schools, a new voice, one that would shape the next phase of the movement. It came from a young woman named Fatou, a shy and quiet student who had never dreamed of standing in front of others, let alone teaching. But something about the music school, about Fatou's example, had stirred something in her. Fatou had started as a student in one of the newer schools, hesitant and uncertain. But under the guidance of her teachers and the inspiration of Fatou's teachings, she blossomed into a confident and skilled Kora player. What surprised everyone, including herself, was her ability to teach others. One afternoon, Fatou observed Fatou in the classroom. The young woman was explaining a difficult rhythm to a group of beginners, and her patience and clarity were remarkable. It was clear to Fatou that Fatou was not only skilled in playing the kora but also in sharing her knowledge in a way that resonated with her students. Fatou knew that Fatou could become an important part of the movement, a new voice who could take the work forward. She approached Fatou after the class and said, "You have a gift, Fatou, not just for music, but for teaching. I think it's time for you to take on a bigger role." Fatou was taken aback. "Me? I'm not ready. I still have so much to learn." "You'll always have something to learn," Fatou said, "but you already have what it takes to be a leader. I believe in you." It was a pivotal moment for Fatou, one that marked the beginning of her journey as a teacher and leader in the movement. Fatou had created a space where women could discover their voices, and now she was passing the torch to the next generation. Chapter 41. The Gathering Storm. As the music schools expanded and the influence of Fatou's work grew, the tension between progress and tradition began to escalate once again. While many were embracing the changes, there were still powerful forces working against the movement. The elders who had once agreed to allow the schools to continue now began to speak out more forcefully, concerned about the shifting roles of women in society. In a distant village, a group of elders led a campaign to close the schools. They argued that the presence of women in public, performing music, was a threat to the established order. They called for a gathering of all the village elders to discuss the issue and decide what action should be taken. Fatou was alerted to the situation by a messenger and immediately set out to meet with the elders. This was not going to be an easy conversation. Fatou had faced opposition before, but the tension was growing. The movement had become something that was no longer just about music, it was about reshaping the very fabric of society. As she approached the village where the meeting was being held, she felt a wave of uncertainty. The battle she had been fighting was no longer just for her dream. It was for the future of every woman who had ever dared to stand up and be heard. Chapter 42. Confrontation at the Elders' Meeting. The meeting was held in the village hall, a large, open space filled with the elders and leaders from surrounding communities. Fatou walked in, her heart pounding in her chest. Amadou stood by her side, offering his silent support, but she knew this was her fight. The elders spoke first, their voices full of conviction. The music school, while it may have been an experiment, has gone too far. It has caused confusion among our people. Women should not be leading in this way. The traditions of our ancestors must be preserved. Fatou stood tall, her eyes scanning the room. She had fought for this, for these women, for the opportunity to change the future. She could not let fear or doubt control her now. Respect for our traditions is important, she began, but so is the right to change when change is necessary. Music, like all art, is not bound by gender. Women have always been a part of our culture, even if history has forgotten that. I am not here to destroy tradition. I am here to build something new, something that will unite us. The elders were not easily swayed, and the tension in the room was palpable. But Fatou's words had struck a chord with some of the younger members of the gathering, who had grown up seeing the transformation in their communities. Chapter 43. The Decision. The elders deliberated for hours, and as the sun began to set, Fatou waited anxiously for the verdict. She had given everything in this fight, and now all she could do was wait for the decision that would determine the future of the music schools. Finally, the head elder spoke. We have heard both sides. We recognize the value of the music schools and the way they have inspired the younger generation. However, we must find a balance between tradition and change. It was a moment of quiet victory for Fatou, but she knew this was just the beginning. The decision was not to close the schools, but to impose new regulations. The schools would continue, but they would be overseen by a council of elders, ensuring that they aligned with traditional values while allowing for progress. Fatou left the meeting exhausted but triumphant. She had won, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 44. A New Path Forward. The compromise reached by the elders marked the beginning of a new chapter in Fatou's journey. While the schools would remain open, they would now operate under the watchful eyes of the council, ensuring that the traditions were respected while allowing for innovation. This arrangement, while not perfect, was a significant victory for Fatou and the women who had risked so much to pursue their dreams. The changes were not immediate, and the council's oversight brought new challenges. Some of the elders insisted on stricter guidelines for the women who wanted to perform publicly, while others sought to impose limitations on the kinds of songs and stories that could be shared. Fatou, though grateful for the victory, knew that this was merely a temporary truce. She would have to continue advocating for the freedom of expression that had been at the heart of her vision. As the weeks passed, Fatou worked hard to find a balance between complying with the council's regulations and maintaining the integrity of the schools. She continued to expand her network of teachers and leaders, making sure that the values of the music schools, empowerment, unity, and the celebration of women's voices were never lost. Meanwhile, Amadou, ever by her side, worked to strengthen the relationship between the music schools and the local communities. His role as a griot had given him the respect of many elders, and he used his influence to foster understanding between the new and traditional ways of life. Fatou's presence at the schools was more strategic now. Instead of being involved in every lesson, she focused on mentoring the new leaders like Amadou, who were now taking on more responsibility. The future was in their hands, and Fatou's legacy was slowly taking shape in the form of a generation of women who could carry the torch forward. Chapter 45. The Growing Network. As the music schools continued to thrive under the new arrangement, Fatou's network of women musicians and teachers expanded rapidly. More and more women, inspired by the success of Fatou's schools, began to reach out for guidance, eager to establish their own music schools in their villages. Fatou had become a symbol of change, and her work was now inspiring a movement that stretched across the country. With Amadou's help, Fatou began to organize regional meetings for the leaders of the music schools. These meetings became a vital space for sharing experiences, discussing challenges, and strategizing about how to continue growing the movement. It was also an opportunity to highlight the impact the music schools were having on women's lives. Stories of women who had found independence, women who had gained respect in their communities, and women who had become powerful voices for change. At one of these meetings, a young woman named Fatou stood up and shared her story. She was from a village in the south, where women were not only discouraged from playing music, but were often forbidden to leave their homes. But Fatou had found a way to learn, secretly practicing the Kora in her room. When she heard about the music schools, she knew she had to take the risk of joining. Fatou's courage was a reminder to Fatou of the stakes involved in this movement. It wasn't just about music. It was about creating a space where women could dream beyond the boundaries set for them, a place where they could be free. After Fatou spoke, Fatou knew that this was a fight worth continuing. It wasn't easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but the impact of the music schools could be seen in the lives of women like Fatou, who had dared to break free from the chains of tradition. Chapter 46. The Media Spotlight. As the music schools grew in influence, they began to attract the attention of the media. What had started as a grassroots movement in a few villages was now making waves across the country. Journalists from both local and national outlets were eager to learn more about the music schools and the woman behind them. One afternoon, Fatou received an invitation to appear on a popular television talk show. It was a huge opportunity for her to spread the message of empowerment, but it also came with its challenges. Fatou had never been one to seek the spotlight. Her focus had always been on the music and the women she had helped. However, she understood that this was an important moment for the movement, and she couldn't afford to shy away from it. Amadou accompanied her to the studio, offering his support as always. The show was live, and Fatou could feel the weight of the moment. The host, a well-known television personality, was excited to have her on the show, but there was a sharpness in his questions that hinted at the skepticism some still had about the music schools. "Fatou," the host began, "your music schools have caused quite a stir. There are many who say that women should not be involved in public performance. What do you say to them?" Fatou took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. "I say that music is not about gender. It's about expression, about sharing stories, about connecting with others. Women have always been a part of our cultural heritage, but their voices have been silenced for far too long. I am here to make sure that changes." Her words resonated with the audience, and as the interview went on, Fatou's passion and determination shone through. The interview marked a turning point for the movement, bringing it to a wider audience and inspiring even more women to step forward and claim their place in the world of music. Chapter 47. Growing Support. In the months that followed the television interview, Fatou's music schools continued to grow in both size and influence. More women were coming forward, eager to be part of the movement, and the media coverage had brought a new wave of support from unexpected quarters. Not only were the music schools receiving donations and grants, but women from different parts of the country were reaching out to start their own schools in their villages and towns. Amadou and Fatou spent countless hours responding to inquiries and providing guidance to those who wanted to establish their own schools. They knew that they couldn't be everywhere at once, but with the help of the growing network of teachers, they were able to keep the momentum going. In one of the larger towns, a group of influential women approached Fatou with a proposal to host a national festival celebrating the music schools. The idea was to bring together women from all over the country who had learned to play the kora and other traditional instruments, to showcase their talents, and to celebrate the empowerment of women through music. Fatou was excited about the idea, but also apprehensive. The festival would be a monumental event, and there were sure to be many obstacles along the way. But with Amadou's encouragement, she agreed to the plan, knowing that this could be the moment that would change everything. Chapter 48. Preparing for the festival. In the months leading up to the festival, Fatou and her team worked tirelessly to organize every detail. The event would be held in the capital city, and it would be a celebration of women's music from every corner of the country. Musicians, dancers, and storytellers would come together to showcase their talents and to celebrate the incredible progress made by the music schools. The preparation was intense, and Fatou knew that this event would be a test of everything they had built. She was determined to make sure that the festival would not only celebrate the women involved in the music schools, but also highlight the larger message of empowerment and equality. Amadou, ever by her side, helped with the logistics, making sure that the performances were well organized and that the festival would run smoothly. As the day of the festival drew nearer, Fatou's excitement grew. This was the culmination of years of hard work, a celebration of all they had achieved. Chapter 49. The festival begins. The day of the festival arrived, and the city was buzzing with excitement. Fatou and Amadou stood together, looking out at the bustling streets filled with musicians, dancers, and supporters from every corner of Mali. The festival was set to take place in a grand outdoor arena, and it had been decorated with vibrant colors, banners, and symbols of empowerment. The air was thick with anticipation, and Fatou could feel the weight of the moment. As the first group of women took the stage, playing traditional melodies on the Kora, the crowd erupted in applause. It was a beautiful sight. Women from all walks of life, from rural villages to urban centers, coming together to share their music and stories. The sounds of the Kora, along with drums and flutes, echoed through the air, filling the space with a sense of unity and purpose. Fatou watched with pride as the performers played, their music carrying the message of empowerment to the crowd. She could see the joy and confidence in their faces, and it filled her heart with a deep sense of accomplishment. These women, who had once been silenced by tradition, were now taking center stage, not just as performers, but as leaders, storytellers, and symbols of change. Amadou, ever the griot, stood beside Fatou, watching the festival unfold. He had always believed in Fatou's vision, and seeing it come to life in such a magnificent way was a testament to her determination and unwavering commitment to change. The festival was more than just a celebration of music. It was a celebration of freedom, of women finding their voices, and of the power of tradition being reshaped for the modern world. Chapter 50. The Voices of Change. As the festival progressed, the performances continued to inspire and captivate the audience. Musicians from different regions of Mali took the stage, each bringing their own unique style and flair to the music. It was a powerful demonstration of the diversity within the movement, with each performance telling its own story of struggle, resilience, and hope. One of the standout performances came from Fatou, Fatou's most promising student, who had been learning to play the Kora under Fatou's mentorship. Aisata's playing was mesmerizing. Her fingers danced across the strings of the instrument with incredible precision, and the melody she created filled the air with emotion. The crowd watched in awe, and as the final notes rang out, there was a moment of stunned silence before the applause erupted. Fatou's heart swelled with pride as she watched Aisata take her place on the stage, confident and powerful. This was the future of the music schools, women who would carry the torch forward, continuing the work that Fatou had started and taking it to new heights. Fatou knew that the movement was no longer just hers. It belonged to all the women who had dared to dream and who had fought to make their voices heard. Amadou stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. He knew how much this moment meant to Fatou, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for everything they had achieved together. The festival was a triumph, not just for Fatou and the music schools, but for all the women who had fought for their place in the world of music. Chapter 51. The Unseen Challenges. Despite the success of the festival, the challenges Fatou faced were far from over. The council, which had initially agreed to allow the music schools to operate under certain conditions, began to apply more pressure as the movement grew in influence. Some of the elders were concerned that the festival had pushed the boundaries too far, and they were starting to question whether the music schools were truly in line with traditional values. Fatou knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She had faced opposition before, but now, with the growing success of the movement, the stakes were higher. The elders were not just concerned about the music, it was about control, about preserving the old ways and resisting the changes that Fatou had brought. Amadou was by her side, as always, offering advice and support. "We must remain steadfast," he said one evening as they discussed the growing tension with the council. "We have already changed the course of history, and we cannot go back now. We must find a way to continue moving forward." Fatou nodded, feeling a deep sense of resolve. She had come too far to let the movement falter now. The challenges ahead would require even more patience, strategy, and unity, but she was ready to face them head-on. The music schools had already transformed the lives of so many women, and she knew that they had the potential to bring about even greater change. Chapter 52. A New Alliance. Fatou knew that to survive the challenges ahead, she would need allies who could stand beside her and support the movement in the face of increasing resistance. Amadou suggested reaching out to some of the influential women who had supported the festival and asking them to join the cause more actively. One of the women Fatou turned to was Miriam, a powerful businesswoman who had been one of the early supporters of the music schools. Miriam had seen the potential in Fatou's vision from the beginning, and her influence in the community was undeniable. She was not only a successful entrepreneur, but also a respected figure in the traditional circles, which made her an ideal ally. Fatou met with Miriam in the quiet of the evening, discussing the growing opposition and the need for stronger support from the community. Miriam listened attentively and, after a long pause, agreed to lend her influence to the cause. She promised to speak with other influential women and leaders in the community, using her connections to rally support for the music schools. With Miriam's backing, Fatou felt a renewed sense of hope. The path ahead would still be difficult, but with the right allies, she knew that they could overcome any obstacles. The movement was growing stronger, and the vision Fatou had for a future where women's voices were no longer silenced was becoming a reality. Chapter 53. The Power of the Community. With Miriam's help, Fatou's movement began to gain even more traction in the community. Influential women, business leaders, and even some of the elders who had initially opposed the music schools began to speak out in support of the cause. They recognized the impact the music schools were having on the lives of women and saw the potential for greater unity and progress within the community. Fatou continued to work tirelessly, organizing events, creating platforms for women to share their music, and fostering a sense of solidarity among the growing network of musicians. Her efforts were beginning to pay off, as the community as a whole began to see the value in what she had started. The music schools had become more than just a space for learning. They were now centers of community building, offering a place for women to gather, to share their stories, and to support one another. The sense of empowerment that came from playing music and being part of this movement was palpable, and Fatou could see that the future was bright for the women who had chosen to join her cause. Chapter 54. Strength in Numbers. As Fatou's music schools flourished, the movement gained more support, not just from women but from men who began to see the beauty in the changes she was advocating. The festival's success had proven that the power of music could transcend boundaries, and it brought with it an unexpected ripple of transformation. Fatou's alliance with Miriam had proven invaluable, and the network of women involved in the movement grew stronger each day. The impact of the music schools was visible not only in the performances, but also in the increased opportunities for women in various sectors. Women were now being recognized for their contributions as musicians, teachers, and leaders. Fatou was proud of how the movement had brought women together, allowing them to stand shoulder to shoulder in a society where they had once been relegated to the background. The sound of the Kora resonated louder than ever, symbolizing not just a musical instrument, but the strength, determination, and resilience of all the women who played it. In every note, Fatou heard the story of struggle, triumph, and the unwavering spirit of her sisters. The message of unity was spreading, not just within Mali, but across borders. Even though their path was not without opposition, the women who stood beside Fatou now felt a deep sense of purpose. As they took their places on stage, each one of them became a symbol of change, an embodiment of the fight for gender equality in a world that had long been indifferent to their voices. Chapter 55. The Quiet Rebellion. Behind the scenes, as the movement continued to gain momentum, the tension between the traditionalists and the reformers grew more palpable. Fatou had managed to garner widespread support from various sectors of society, but there were still some powerful figures within the council who were determined to stop the changes she had initiated. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a local gathering, Fatou and Amadou discussed the situation over tea. They both understood that while the festival had ignited a spark, it was only the beginning of a larger, ongoing struggle. The traditionalists were not going to relinquish their grip on cultural norms easily, and they were ready to use their influence to discredit the music schools and the growing support behind them. "It's not enough to have their support, Fatou," Amadou warned her gently. "We must prepare for the long haul. Our work has just begun." Fatou nodded solemnly, aware of the challenges ahead. She could not afford to be complacent, no matter how much progress they had made. The battle was far from over, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had fought for this moment her entire life, and she wasn't about to let anything, nor anyone, deter her from seeing it through. Chapter 56. The Heart of the Struggle. The months following the festival were filled with continued challenges and victories. Fatou had learned to navigate the political landscape more strategically, working behind the scenes to build alliances and secure further support for her vision. Her determination only grew as she faced more opposition, and she began to realize that the movement was much larger than herself. Her efforts to keep the music schools thriving had also meant finding ways to fund the programs. Many of the women who had become involved needed financial support for travel, lessons, and materials, and Fatou had to find ways to keep the schools running without depending solely on outside donations. With Miriam's help, they managed to secure sponsorships from various organizations that saw the value in promoting gender equality through music. As the community of musicians continued to grow, so did the impact of the movement. More and more women, both young and old, came forward to join the music schools, eager to learn the Kora and other traditional instruments. Fatou watched with pride as they formed a united front, each of them confident and unafraid to take their place in the spotlight. Chapter 57. Beyond the Borders. Word of the music school's success began to spread beyond the borders of Mali. Women from neighboring countries, inspired by the movement, started traveling to Mali to learn and contribute. Fatou's dream of a broader, Pan-African movement was slowly becoming a reality. The shared experiences of women across the continent, united by music, transcended geographical boundaries. In these international exchanges, Fatou saw the power of music to unite diverse communities and create lasting change. It was no longer just a battle for the rights of women in Mali. It was a movement that resonated with women everywhere who had long been silenced or marginalized. Amadou, ever the griot, had been instrumental in helping share the stories of their struggle with other African nations. He had taken on the role of cultural ambassador, organizing gatherings and performances to show the world what Fatou and her music schools had achieved. His belief in the power of stories and song had become more profound as the movement expanded. Fatou and Amadou realized that the movement they had started was becoming something far larger than they had ever imagined. What had begun as a simple desire to bring women's voices into the music world had evolved into a full-scale cultural renaissance, one that was being felt across Africa and beyond. Chapter 58. The Sound of Freedom. As Fatou and Amadou traveled together to visit different regions of Mali, they could see firsthand how their efforts had changed lives. The faces of women who had once felt invisible now shone with pride as they stood before crowds, instruments in hand, their voices resonating through the air. These women were no longer confined to the shadows. They were now the leaders, the storytellers, and the musicians of their generation. Each community they visited had a story to tell, a story of struggle, a story of perseverance, and a story of triumph. Fatou and Amadou listened intently, knowing that the power of music had done more than just give women a platform. It had given them freedom. The ability to create music, to tell their stories, and to connect with others was a form of liberation, one that would reverberate for generations to come. As Fatou played her Kora, she felt the weight of their shared journey. Every note was a reminder of the sacrifices, the challenges, and the victories that had brought them to this point. With Amadou by her side, she knew that the music they had started would continue to grow, weaving its way through the fabric of African society. Chapter 59. The Changing Winds. As time passed, the winds of change continued to blow across Mali. While there was still opposition from some quarters, the momentum of Fatou's movement had reached a point where it could not be easily undone. The younger generation of Malians, inspired by the stories and the music, were now at the forefront of the fight for gender equality, standing as a testament to the power of transformation. Amadou had always believed in the long-term vision, but even he was amazed at the speed with which Fatou's ideas had caught fire. He knew the struggle was not over, but he also knew that the foundation for lasting change had been firmly established. Fatou, ever the optimist, understood that there was still much work to be done. But with every new student, every performance, and every song that resonated in the hearts of those who heard it, she knew they were closer to achieving their ultimate goal, a world where women's voices were not only heard but celebrated. Chapter 60. The Gathering Storm. The movement was growing stronger, but so were the forces working to suppress it. Fatou knew that the fight was far from over, and the battle for equality had entered a more dangerous phase. The traditionalists, who had once been passive in their opposition, were now actively trying to discredit the music schools and undermine the women's movement. It was no longer just about music. It was about societal power, control, and the role of women in Mali. One afternoon, as Fatou sat with Amadou, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The tension was palpable, and she knew that her next steps would be crucial. Amadou, ever the sage, tried to reassure her. "Fatou, we've come too far to turn back now," he said, his voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of concern. "They will try to intimidate us, but they cannot silence us. We have the power of the people with us." Fatou nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that there would be sacrifices to come. She had never been one to shy away from challenges, but the reality of the opposition they faced now felt overwhelming. The traditionalists were using their influence to create divisions within the communities Fatou had worked so hard to unite. Yet she was resolute. She would not let fear dictate her actions. The storm was coming, and Fatou could only hope that the foundation she had built would be strong enough to withstand it. Chapter 61. Facing the Fire. The opposition against Fatou's movement escalated quickly. Rumors were spread, lies were told, and the media, which had once been supportive of the music schools, began to turn. The pressure on the women involved in the movement increased, and many were forced to leave the schools for fear of retribution. Fatou stood before a group of her students one afternoon, facing a wave of doubt and uncertainty. The music school, once a place of hope, now felt like a battlefield. The sound of the Kora, which had once symbolized freedom, now seemed to echo with the weight of the struggle they faced. "We will not be silenced," Fatou said, her voice firm, though her heart ached. "Our cause is just. The truth will always find a way to the light. We have come too far to allow them to tear us apart." Her students, many of whom had been with her from the beginning, nodded resolutely. They were not afraid. Fatou's strength, her unshakable belief in their mission, had inspired them to stand firm. They were willing to face the consequences of their involvement, knowing that the future they were fighting for would be worth the sacrifice. As the fires of opposition raged around them, Fatou and her students found a new sense of unity. They would face the storm together, knowing that their music had the power to change the world. Chapter 62. A New Dawn. After weeks of intense pressure, Fatou and her movement reached a critical juncture. The traditionalists had gone to extreme lengths to discredit them, even going so far as to threaten the livelihoods of those who supported the music schools. Yet Fatou and her allies refused to back down. The turning point came when one of the most respected griots in Mali, a man who had once been a fierce critic of Fatou's movement, came forward publicly in support of her. His endorsement carried immense weight, and it was a game-changer. His words resonated deeply with the people. "The music we play is not just a sound," the griot said during a public gathering. "It is a language of the soul. It is a tool of liberation, a path to unity. Fatou's dream is not her own. It is the dream of every woman who has ever been silenced. The griot's endorsement had a ripple effect, and within days, others followed suit, voicing their support for Fatou and the music schools. The traditionalists, realizing that they were losing the battle for public opinion, began to pull back, and the pressure on Fatou's movement slowly began to ease. With renewed hope, Fatou and her students began to rebuild what had been damaged. The music schools continued to grow, and the voices of the women who played the Kora were louder than ever before. Chapter 63: The Heart of the Music. As the music schools expanded, so did the depth of the relationships between the students and their mentors. Fatou's bond with her students grew stronger, as did her bond with Amadou. The foundation of their shared love for music, which had once been the spark of their relationship, was now the cornerstone of a broader movement for social change. Amadou had always been more than just a mentor to Fatou. He had been her anchor in the storm, a steady presence in her life when everything seemed uncertain. Their shared love for the Kora had been the thread that tied them together, and now it was the thread that held the movement together. As they sat together one evening, the sound of Fatou's Kora filled the air. It was a simple melody, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. The trials, the setbacks, the victories, everything was embedded in that one song. "We've come so far," Fatou said softly, her fingers gently strumming the strings. "But there is still so much left to do." Amadou nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "We will keep going, Fatou. Together, we will change the world." The sound of the Kora seemed to echo in the night, a promise of a future where women's voices were heard, celebrated, and revered. Chapter 64: The Ties That Bind. As the months passed, Fatou's music schools became more than just places of learning. They became symbols of resistance, strength, and community. The women who once felt invisible were now at the forefront, leading workshops, performances, and seminars on the power of music as a tool for social change. Fatou watched with pride as the women who had once been her students became mentors themselves, teaching younger generations the same values she had instilled in them. The connection between Fatou and her students deepened, as they realized that they were not just learning an instrument. They were learning to challenge societal norms, to question the roles they had been given, and to assert their place in a world that had long sought to silence them. One evening, Fatou stood before her students, reflecting on the journey they had taken together. The room was filled with the familiar sound of the Kora, but this time, it was different. The music was no longer just a means of expression. It had become a force that transcended boundaries, a rallying cry for women everywhere. "Every note you play is a statement," Fatou said, her voice filled with emotion. "It is a declaration that we will no longer be silenced. It is a promise that our voices will be heard, no matter the cost." Her students nodded in agreement, their eyes shining with determination. They had learned from Fatou not just the technical skills of music, but the importance of standing up for what they believed in. Together, they had forged a bond that went beyond music. It was a bond of solidarity, of shared purpose. Chapter 65: The Weight of Legacy. As the movement continued to grow, Fatou began to think more about her legacy. What would she leave behind? What kind of world would her efforts create for future generations? These thoughts consumed her during quiet moments, and as she spent more time reflecting, she realized that her work had already begun to shape the future. The students she had taught, the women who had found their voices through music, were already creating their own paths. Fatou had given them the tools, but they were the ones who were forging their own futures, changing their communities, and challenging the status quo. Her influence had spread far beyond the walls of the music schools. It had become a movement that was shifting the very fabric of society. Fatou's bond with Amadou had also deepened. Together, they had faced the highs and lows of the movement, and their relationship had only grown stronger. The trust and respect they shared were built on a foundation of shared experiences and mutual support. Amadou had been her partner in every sense of the word, her mentor, her confidant, and her love. As they sat together one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Fatou felt a sense of peace. They had come so far, and though the journey was far from over, she knew that they had already achieved something remarkable. Their work had sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. Chapter 66. The Winds of Change. The winds of change had begun to blow across Mali, and the ripples of Fatou's movement were being felt across the African continent. What had started as a small, local effort to bring women into the world of music had grown into a global movement for gender equality and social change. Women from all over Africa were traveling to Mali to learn, to perform, and to join the fight for equality. Fatou had always known that her vision was bigger than just her own country, but seeing it spread across borders filled her with awe. The power of music to unite, to heal, and to empower was undeniable. Fatou and Amadou had traveled to neighboring countries to share their message, and in every place they visited, they found eager listeners and supporters. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, Fatou knew that the movement was unstoppable. The younger generations, inspired by the women who had come before them, were ready to carry the torch forward. The music schools were no longer just about learning to play an instrument. They had become training grounds for a new generation of leaders, activists, and changemakers. Chapter 67. The Final Performance. After years of hard work and dedication, Fatou and her students were preparing for what would be their most important performance yet. It was to be held at the National Festival, a momentous occasion that would bring together the brightest minds in the country. Fatou knew that this performance would solidify their place in history and send a powerful message to the world. The students practiced tirelessly, their fingers flying over the strings of the Kora, their voices blending in harmony. Fatou's heart swelled with pride as she watched them rehearse. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, a moment to show the world the power of their music, the strength of their resolve, and the beauty of their unity. On the night of the performance, the air was electric with anticipation. The crowd gathered in the large open-air arena, their eyes fixed on the stage. Fatou stood at the front of the stage, her Kora in hand, surrounded by her students. As the first notes filled the air, the crowd fell silent, captivated by the beauty of the music. The performance was flawless, each note a testament to the journey they had taken together. The sound of the Kora echoed through the arena, and for a brief moment, Fatou felt as if the entire world was listening. Chapter 68. A Legacy Secured. The performance at the National Festival was a resounding success, and it cemented Fatou's legacy as a pioneer of change. The movement she had started was no longer just a dream, it had become a reality. Women's voices were being heard, their contributions were being recognized, and the power of music had become a force for social change. Fatou received offers from international organizations and governments, all eager to support the continuation of her work. But Fatou knew that the most important thing was to ensure that the movement would continue long after she was gone. She had built something that was bigger than herself, a movement that would live on through the women whose lives had been changed by the music schools. As Fatou looked at the faces of her students, she knew that the future was in good hands. They would carry the torch forward, passing it to the next generation, ensuring that the music would never stop. Chapter 69. The New Era. Fatou's movement had reached a tipping point, and it was clear that the future was bright for women in Mali and beyond. The music schools continued to thrive, and the impact of Fatou's work was being felt in every corner of the country. Women were now leading in every aspect of society: music, politics, business, and beyond. Fatou watched with pride as her students went on to achieve great things. Some became renowned musicians, others became leaders in their communities, and some even started their own music schools to continue the work that Fatou had started. The ripple effect of her movement was far-reaching, and its impact would be felt for generations. Fatou knew that this was just the beginning. The movement she had started was continuing to evolve, adapting to the changing needs of society. But one thing remained constant: the power of music to inspire change and create a more equitable world. Chapter 70. The Final Song. As Fatou sat in the quiet of the evening, the sound of her Kora filled the room. She had come a long way, and the journey had been more than she could have ever imagined. The movement she had started had changed the lives of countless women, and it had transformed society in ways she had never thought possible. But even more than that, it had given her a sense of fulfillment that she had never known before. The music she had once dreamed of playing had become her voice, her instrument of change, and her legacy. With Amadou by her side, Fatou looked to the future with hope. The world was changing, and she had played a part in that change. And as the final notes of her song echoed through the room, she knew that her work would live on, not just in the music, but in the hearts of all those who had been touched by it. Her journey had come full circle, and the final song had been played.